Greetings, listener, and welcome to Ryan Rambles You To Rest, the sleep podcast where I talk at length about matters of nearly no urgent need nor heavy impact on our daily lives, in the interest of helping you there off to a more peaceful state. In this episode, I thought we might enjoy a double dose of our knockout segment, The Scroll. A Scroll-O-Rama, if you will. A scroll-utopia of unimportant internet tidbits. A veritable scrollgasboard of sleep-inducing trivia. You'll be incapacitated by the lack of exciting information as we ascend slowly into the sleepy heights of the scrollosphere. Because I am still stinging from the eggplant revelations, as I am sure you are too, our hiatus from the roundup of vegetables I know will continue, though I do have some more information in this episode's update. Before we begin, I would like to recommend that you subscribe to this show on your podcast platform of choice or YouTube. For news and announcements, follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Ryan Rambles Pod, or follow me at Anvil1 on Twitter. Our soundtrack is by Disparition. Following our last installment of the Roundup, in which I have been naming vegetables I know, it came to my attention that the eggplant, so named for its long-ago resemblance to eggs, is in fact a fruit. While diving deeper for last episode's update, I discovered that the eggplant's genus is Solanum, which it shares with both tomato and potato. Of course, this set off a bit of a red flag for me with regard to the potato's status as a vegetable. Probably for both of us. Although I have yet to name the potato in the roundup of vegetables I know, I felt that for the sake of my and your sanity, dear listener, that I should prioritize research in earnest and advance of not only my own potentially embarrassing misnaming, but more importantly to face fiercely and head on what could be a shocking revelation to both of us. Thankfully, I can now report, with the presumption of validity at Wikipedia, that the potato is a vegetable. A root vegetable, more specifically, of the species tuberosum. So whereas our observable reality has thrice been betrayed by what might be called the fruiting of vegetables, a bullet hath been dodged by our good friend the tuber, the potato. To celebrate, and what better way to celebrate than eating, I thought it might be nice to read to you the opening to the Wikipedia entry on potatoes, because there are herein some interesting facts. The potato is a starchy tuber of the plant Solanum tuberosum, and is a root vegetable native to the Americas, with the plant itself being a perennial in the nightshade family Solanaceae. Wild potato species, originating in modern-day Peru, can be found throughout the Americas, from Canada to southern Chile. The potato was originally believed to have been domesticated by Native Americans independently in multiple locations. But later, genetic testing of the wide variety of cultivars with wild species traced a single origin for potatoes in the area of present-day southern Peru and extreme northwestern Bolivia. Potatoes were domesticated approximately 7,000 to 10,000 years ago there from a species in the Solanum breviaculae complex. In the Andes region of South America, where the species is indigenous, some close relatives of the potato are cultivated. So there you have it. The potato is 7 to 10,000 years old, or at least human cultivation of it is 7 to 10,000 years old, and it comes from South America. Now, I've been to Peru one time, and I can say that it is actually quite interesting because there are so many varieties of potato, and since they originated there, you encounter many varieties of potato while you're there. And one of the popular national dishes of Peru is the causa. The causa is, to put it super simply, mashed potatoes with Peruvian flavors, but often they're built and layered almost to look like a cake might look, where you'd have a layer of potato and then a layer of filling, and then another layer of potato, and then another filling or another topping on top of that. To my knowledge, there aren't rules about how the causa is built, but many of the times I've had causas, they've been built out of a cylindrical shape and stacked as such. Although one time I went to a Peruvian restaurant and the causas were served loosely or more loosely. I highly recommend it though. You get fillings that can be super tasty, often going off of the popular seafood flavors and recipes that make Peruvian ceviche popular. And you'll also find the incorporation of the ají amarillo pepper, which I mentioned in the pepper section of the vegetables I know, prior to realizing that the pepper is a fruit and not a vegetable. Moving onward. Potatoes were introduced to Europe from the Americas in the second half of the 16th century by the Spanish. Today, they are a staple food in many parts of the world and an integral part of much of the world's food supply. So that is also totally wild to me, that Europe didn't have potatoes until the 1500s. There were no French fries. There was no corned beef hash. There were no famous... Was there a shepherd's pie before the 1500s? And what was put on top of it, if there was? It wasn't potato. Perhaps it was sand or cotton. Perhaps for next episode, I can take the opportunity to do a little bit of research into some of our favorite European recipes that have potatoes and see if any of them predate the 16th century, where we might be able to find out more about the creation of those dishes. Moving on. As of 2014, potatoes were the world's fourth largest food crop, after maize, corn, wheat, and rice. Following millennia of selective breeding, there are now over 5,000 different types of potato. Over 99% of presently cultivated potatoes worldwide descended from varieties that originated in the lowlands of south-central Chile. The importance of the potato as a food source and culinary ingredient varies by region and is still changing. It remains an essential crop in Europe, especially northern and eastern Europe, where per capita production is still the highest in the world, while the most rapid expansion in production over the past few decades has occurred in southern and eastern Asia, with China and India leading the world in overall production as of 2018. So it's interesting, right? The potato, which became hugely popular in Europe and the United States, is now, just in the last decade or so, really blowing up in Asia. Now, I think I've had a few potato dishes from Indian restaurants, but I can't think of very many Asian or Southeast Asian potato-focused dishes off the top of my head. That's another thing maybe I can look into. Like the tomato, the potato is a nightshade in the genus Solanum, and the vegetative and fruiting parts of the potato contain the toxin solanine, which is dangerous for human consumption. Normal potato tubers that have been grown and stored properly produce glycoalkaloids in amounts small enough to be negligible to human health. But if green sections of the plant, namely sprouts and skins, are exposed to light, the tuber can accumulate a high enough concentration of glycoalkaloids to affect human health. Now, I've seen this before. If you have a potato that is no longer very good, the outside skin starts to get sort of a greenish hue to it. And if you cut into that skin or you shave a little bit off, you'll find that there's a significant greening underneath the skin and above the flesh of the potato. And that's a point where you're supposed to not eat it. They say that it shouldn't hurt you, but that at that point the potato just isn't that good anymore. So you would probably just be well advised to throw it away and run out to the store and buy new potatoes. Well, there you go. Some interesting facts about the potato. I won't bore you any longer about the potato in the hopes that I will enjoy the opportunity to ramble on about the tater tuber when we continue the roundup of vegetables I know. During our first journey down the rabbit hole of Wikipedia's random article button, we came across the baseball player named Ken Holcomb. The article itself only told us about his 9 years in Major League Baseball, despite the fact that he lived to be 91 years old, passing away in 2010, and I thought we might like to learn more about the other 82 years of this athlete's life. Unfortunately, there is very little available on the internet that can tell us more about the life and times of right-handed Major League Baseball pitcher Ken Holcomb. Most of what is out there are just his stats and his baseball cards. However, I was able to locate his obituary, and that was really it. Here is the minor information available from that document. Kenneth Edward Bud Holcomb, 91, of 32 Botany Drive, passed away Monday, March 15th, 2010, at the Bryan Center of Weaverville. A native of Yancey County, he had resided in Buncombe County most of his life. He was a professional baseball player, where he entered the majors in 1945 with the New York Yankees and joined the Chicago White Sox in 1950. He later was employed for 20 years with Beacon Manufacturing, where he retired in 1984 and was of the Jehovah Witness faith. So we get a little bit more about Holcomb. We learn about where he lived, where he passed away, and that he worked for Beacon Manufacturing for 20 years. Unfortunately, after a look at the Beacon Manufacturing website, I couldn't find anything in a cursory glance about Bud Kenneth Edward Holcomb. I guess they didn't want to take advantage of the fact that they had a major league pitcher employed for 20 years at their company. And we've also learned that he was a Jehovah's Witness. I have to admit that is a faith I know very little about, except the door-to-door stuff. When I was a kid, they were kind of all over the place. the prevalence of the Jehovah's Witnesses was definitely noticeable when I was a kid, whereas today I can't remember the last time that I encountered them. If you happen to know anything about Kenneth Edward Bud Holcomb, or his major league career, his teammates, or just have a favorite baseball player who might have passed away, let me know. Last time during our Really Random Topics segment, where we went on a stirring journey down the rabbit hole of Wikipedia's random article button, we also learned about a popular 19th century acting family known as the Kembles. From the article, we learned of an allegedly popular 21st century actor, descendant from the Kembles, named Sebastian Croft. In the interim, I have used the popular movie and TV website IMDb, which is short for the Internet Movie Database, to learn more about Mr. Croft. If he is, in fact, popular, as the wiki article suggests, I was personally not aware. Born in December 2001, Croft has appeared in only so many productions. He is best known for playing the young Eddard, or Ned, Stark in 2 episodes of the 6th season from 2016 of the extremely popular HBO television soap opera Game of Thrones. If that does not ring a bell, you may otherwise recall Mr. Croft's appearances as young David in Hippopotamus and young Robert Pulaski in I'll Find You. While we were learning about the Kemble family, I attempted to recall other famous 20th and 21st century acting families, but of course could only remember a couple. Since we have learned about Mr. Sebastian Croft, descendant of the Kemble acting family, I thought it might bring some closure to that part of our journey to list a few from the internet in our first segment of The Scroll. I found a list on yardbaker.com. It is actually rather extensive, and I have to admit I felt pretty darn embarrassed scrolling through it that I was only able to originally recall the Estevez Sheen, Douglas, and Hankses, the latter of whom were not on this website. Now, in my opinion, a few of these so-called acting families don't quite stack up to the all-encompassing family of actors, such as the famous Kemble family. Just because a pair of actors are related or married does not mean they are an acting family, so to speak. I personally feel as though there ought to be more than one generation of actors, or otherwise a sizable single generation with several well-known actors in one family. For this reason and other reasons, I will omit a few entries, and likely will not attempt to get through the entire scroll, as the number of entries is quite a lot more than I had originally expected. This yardbaker.com has organized the famous acting families in alphabetical order, so we'll begin at the top and work our way through it. Our first famous acting family is the Arquettes. Now, to be fair, this is a single generation of extremely famous actors. They're all siblings, although Yardbaker is quick to point out that both their father and their grandfather were also Hollywood actors, just not as famous. Now, Rosanna, of course, is one of the most famous for Desperately Seeking Susan and Pulp Fiction. And Patricia Arquette, who I sort of grew up more with in the 90s, who, of course, won an Oscar for Boyhood, but I think I might have first seen in True Romance. She had a bit of a run in the 90s, as did David Arquette, their brother. I remember that he was doing a decent amount of kind of indie movies. Indie movies in general were kind of a hip thing in the mid to late 90s, and he found his way into a number of those before being kind of super popular. Not super popular, but by being popular with the movie Scream, which itself was very popular. I'm not sure that I have a lot to say about the Arquettes, so much as I've always kind of liked the Arquettes. I just usually like when they pop up in a movie that I'm watching. It kind of tends to mean that there's something quirky or interesting about it. They've all always been kind of a little bit on the fringes and picking opportunities that fit into maybe not always completely independent cinema, but definitely not just stock mainstream fare. The next acting family on the list is the Baldwin brothers. Once again, another single generation, and I feel like I'm already breaking my rule. But that said, it's impossible to deny that the Baldwin family is around and has been around for quite a while. Of course, Alec Baldwin is the most famous and probably most successful. He got pretty big when I was younger. He was kind of showing up as a leading guy in a lot of things like The Hunt for Red October, where they were sort of pushing him into fitting in the like Tom Cruise direction, I want to say. But it's interesting because as he's gotten older, he kind of had a comeback in the mid-2000s and has become far more popular in pop culture, or maybe came back into favor with my generation during this time. Also very prolific have been Stephen and Danny Baldwin. Stephen saw a decent amount of popularity, I think, in the 90s. I remember him best probably for his role in The Usual Suspects, which was a very popular indie crime movie with a lot of twists and turns from the 90s. And then, of course, Danny Baldwin, maybe a lot of people don't remember, but the TV show Homicide: Life on the Street featured him, and a cast of many other absolutely fantastic actors, and surrounded by great writing and directing. I like to think of Homicide: Life on the Street as kind of the harbinger of solid ensemble cast television. Of course, there are a lot of examples of it out there, but Homicide was one of the first to do a relatively solid serial drama for multiple seasons with tons of characters that would fall in and out of favor as the seasons went on. And Homicide came with a lot of grit. It wasn't always an easy show to watch, and very often the story was about how the complexities and horror of the job itself would take a toll on the detectives. It's probably one of the last television police dramas before we got into the more modern age of questioning more deeply the police state itself. It's certainly worth going back to visit, though, because you'll see so many people that were great. Some actors that were older and finding their way back to a very serious acting space because the show was very serious. And then a number of younger actors that were up and coming. Our first multi-generational acting family will be the Bridges. Of course, Lloyd Bridges is the father of both Jeff and Beau Bridges. My main memory of Lloyd Bridges, of course, is his presence in the Abram Zucker airplane movies. He famously picked the wrong week to quit sniffing glue. And he was pretty hilarious. Now, today, his sons are far more famous. Beau has appeared in many TV shows and movies, but I can't think of seeing him recently in something. Whereas, of course, Jeff Bridges is the sort of big one in the family, if you will. I suppose I grew up with Jeff Bridges. He was a star of Tron, which was a really big movie for me when I was a little kid. I think going as somebody in Tron was my first Halloween memory, and I don't remember at all whether I was going as a specific character in Tron or if I was just a, person or program that would exist in that Tron world. So my costume was all the circuitry and sort of body armor that they had in the movie. However, I didn't have a very elaborate costume, and I definitely didn't make it myself. But my mom sure put in quite a lot of effort. I recall that she used tape. I think it might have been painter's tape to do all of the circuitry. I was wearing a sweatshirt, I believe, for that. And if you remember in the movie, their armor and clothing has this very kind of soft gray look, so a gray sweatshirt would make perfect sense, actually. And then I had to have a helmet, of course, and if I remember correctly, my mom made the helmet out of a cut-out milk carton, plastic milk carton, and gave the milk carton itself the same tape treatment that she had given the sweatshirt. So it was a pretty cool homemade Tron for Halloween. Now, Jeff Bridges also went through a pretty good phase of popularity during that time. He was in several movies. The only one really that I have some memory of how I felt at the time of might have been the John Carpenter film Starman. But I know that he appeared in a lot of things then. And then I want to say that Jeff Bridges disappeared for a bit. For almost 10 years, it seemed like. Maybe it was about that long. But I barely was aware of him, if he was around, through the 90s. It really wasn't until he exploded onto the screen in The Big Lebowski. Of course, The Big Lebowski is a favorite among many, many people. And definitely in my generation and among my friends a big favorite. You know, we were, a lot of us in film school at the time, and just thought that the film on most levels was just a masterpiece. The Coens really leaned into their style and really found a character and a group of characters really that were charming and fresh and interesting and completely unique. And then you could easily make a case that The Big Lebowski was one of the best written movies perhaps ever. It's definitely up there. The screenplay from the finished product point of view is immaculate, and its use of humor and callbacks, just the sheer number of lines of dialogue that are repeated, like phrases and ideas that continue to surface throughout the movie, are just fantastic, and it really holds together, just like the rug ties the room together. All in all, it's a delightful picture, and I think that's really sort of what got Jeff Bridges going again. And then it seemed like he might never go away. And I like that. I think Jeff Bridges is fantastic. I don't always love the movies that he's in, but I always love him in the movies that he's in. And he's just fantastic. Our next family in the scroll of famous acting families, inspired by the Wikipedia entry we read about the Kemble acting family, are the Carradines. Now, I have to admit that I'm very sort of not knowledgeable about the Carradines. Of course, I'm aware of them, and I've seen a lot of their work, but I'm not very knowledgeable about them. John Carradine was a relatively famous actor in the 1930s and into the 60s. His sons are probably the better known, in particular David Carradine, who was famous for Kung Fu and made an appearance sort of revisiting his Kung Fu celebrity in Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill. And his brother, Keith Carradine, appeared in Deadwood, and I remember that because Deadwood was fantastic, and he, along with everyone, was good in Deadwood. And then what I have to admit that I didn't realize until coming to this scroll is that Robert Carradine is their brother, and I only remember him in hindsight from being a kid and seeing Revenge of the Nerds, and he was kind of the main character in that. And he's an iconic 80s persona from that movie, and it's kind of wild to me that I never made that connection before. But I guess it was before I was really making these sorts of connections. I didn't make them very often. But it is interesting. Sometimes you just don't know. Furthermore, this is our first tri-generational family, as Keith Carradine's daughter is Martha Plimpton. Once again, another connection that I never made before until looking at this list, or maybe somebody had told me, but I just wasn't listening, or I didn't really internalize the information. And again, not a big expert on the family, but I do remember Martha Plimpton in Goonies And I think probably everybody in my age group can remember that. Goonies, of course, was a kind of iconic movie for my generation, and it would be preposterous to not recognize the influence that it and similar movies have had on current culture. We wouldn't have Stranger Things, which I think is a fabulous show, if it wasn't for the Goonies, or Stand By Me, or even the television adaptation of It. These sort of scary teen or young adult movies. And this 80s nostalgia has picked up, and Stranger Things is a good example of where it's been well embraced and well executed and turned out to be a lot of fun. Continuing with the C's in our famous acting families, we have what is a pretty broadly famous acting and directing family, which is the Coppola family. Pretty much everybody in the United States, I imagine, and a good chunk of the film-consuming world knows about the Coppola family. They're easily one of the most famous families for their enigmatic nature, you might say. Of course, Francis Ford Coppola is the top of the food chain, if you will, and famous for being considered one of the biggest directors in at least American film history, famous for The Godfather, which is arguably one of the most technically perfect films, American films ever made, and obviously also big for Apocalypse Now, considered one of the more critical anti-war movies, although I always thought it was strangely not a war movie, more of a surreal dream of sorts, especially if you happen to see the Redux edition of Apocalypse Now, where it's something like 30 minutes longer, and everything that they add to the movie is just bizarre. Like, there's an entire French plantation sequence that's strange. It's everything that is added to the original release is just odd, and you can definitely see why those things were removed when the movie originally came out. On its own, the movie was already a strange and hard-hitting picture, and just imagine what people would have thought about it with all of these almost comically out-of-place scenes in a war environment. But these many years later, it's actually kind of interesting to watch the movie with these extra scenes and see how they actually blend very perfectly into the film. They don't seem like they don't belong, but they create a very different experience, especially if you have the luck of seeing it in the theater. Now, Francis did have a couple of siblings who were also influential or a part of the business. August Coppola was in the film industry, and so was Talia Shire, his sister, who did some acting. And even going sort of further down the family tree, another generation, of course, perhaps the most famous is Nicolas Cage, who has had a epic acting career. Early on, he was pretty big for being in the early Coen brothers film Raising Arizona, which is probably one of the funniest movies I think I've ever seen, and still holds up to this day. And also famous for his Oscar run with Leaving Las Vegas, which seems like a million years ago. But he was really all over the place for a while there. You'd see Nicolas Cage pop up pretty constantly, I would say, almost through the 80s and 90s. And it's interesting that lately he's had a bit of a resurgence too. He's, in the last maybe 10 years, shown up in just some of the most strange and bizarre independent movies with weird plots and stories, really fringe stuff. The kind of movies that would show up at a drive-in or, I don't want to say straight to video, but maybe they would be straight to streaming now at this point. But that kind of takes them down a peg. He definitely seems to choose really interesting projects where he can really pour his energy into it, and he's got quite an energy. Also famous in the family is Talia Shire's son, Jason Schwartzman, who I think maybe the first time I saw him was in Rushmore, and of course he's been in films and writing and producing ever since then. He's been quite the partner to Wes Anderson, of course. They partnered on Rushmore, and I think continuously since then. I don't have a list in front of me of all the projects that they worked on together, but there aren't many that Jason Schwartzman didn't have some involvement with, including the most recent, The French Dispatch, which features Schwartzman in credits beyond just appearing in the film as a writer and I think a producer. The Yardbaker article in this scroll also points out very interestingly that the direct descendants of Carmine Coppola and Italia Penino has reportedly been nominated for more than 20 Academy Awards, which of course means that we shouldn't leave out before we go Sofia Coppola. Sofia, who directed a couple of movies and also did some acting, but her directing drew the most attention. And I think also brought back into vogue Bill Murray, who has also turned out to be very popular with Wes Anderson. I think these groups are all sort of intertwined and intermingled, if you ask me. But it's definitely impressive to have so many Oscars nominations in one family. As we continue through the seas, of course, we come to the Curtis family. Now, for me and my generation, of course, Jamie Lee Curtis is the big one in this family, or the most famous, because she was in Halloween, first and foremost, and during that period continued to appear in other places, including James Cameron's True Lies. She's always been kind of there for us. But my parents' generation, of course, know even better her parents. Tony Curtis was very famous for an extremely long career. And then her mom, Janet Leigh, is probably one of the most famous actresses in horror, in addition to Jamie Lee Curtis, for her appearance in Alfred Hitchcock's, at the time, controversial film Psycho. I don't think I have much to add to this, except to say that I'm excited to, at some point, continue on with the Halloween saga. I haven't watched the latest, but I enjoy the series, as bombastic as it gets. And I think the one from a few years ago, by David Gordon Green was pretty good. The Dern family would be the first in the D's for the famous acting families in this scroll from yardbaker.com. Of course, Laura Dern is a huge favorite to my generation for her appearances in many films, and even today in many films and TV shows. She might have been most broadly recognizable to my generation and slightly younger generations for being in Jurassic Park, which is, of course, huge. But I also appreciate that she has found her way into special roles in other interesting films by other filmmakers. She, of course, was in Wild at Heart and teamed up again with David Lynch for Twin Peaks: The Return, more recently in 2017. And she also found her way into the new Star Wars movies. Now, going back to Wild at Heart, her mother, Diane Ladd, is a famous actress who I'm not personally super familiar with, but she has earned Academy Award nominations for Wild at Heart, which she was in with her daughter, as well as Rambling Rose, which also starred Laura Dern, and Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, which was much earlier in 1974. Lastly, there is, of course, Bruce Dern, Laura's father and Diane's husband. He is definitely also hugely famous, but for my parents' generation, he was in quite a few big movies and has always been a sort of staple of actors in the 70s and 80s in particular. Although, if I'm honest, I'm not the most insightful as to all of Bruce Dern's appearances, and I'm trying to limit myself from not looking every single family up here beyond this scroll that I'm doing. And to that extent, I should apologize for my limited knowledge in each of these cases. Definitely, I think one of the two most famous actors, father-son, are Kirk and Michael Douglas. And although this represents just two people, I think that it's impossible to not mention the Douglases because of how completely prolific they've both been. I will very quickly read the Douglas family entry here. Kirk and Michael Douglas were pretty much the closest thing to father-son Hollywood royalty. Kirk, champion a detective story, who passed away in February 2020 at 103 years old. Son, Michael, meanwhile, won an Oscar for his role as corporate raider Gordon Gekko in Wall Street, and also is remembered for starring in acclaimed films like Romancing the Stone, Fatal Attraction, and The American President. Additionally, Michael's mom, Diana, played Peg in the hit Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. In any case, the Douglases are huge. I can say that I know Kirk Douglas mainly because of my fascination with Stanley Kubrick. Douglas, of course, was famous for being in Stanley Kubrick's epic Spartacus, and before that, Kubrick's lesser-known masterpiece, Paths of Glory. And everyone who's seen Paths of Glory, therefore, knows Kirk Douglas. He was, of course, the main actor in that movie. But what I like about Paths of Glory in terms of the actors is also some of the supporting cast, which included Timothy Carey, who I kind of got into for a little while back in film school. Timothy Carey is not only one of the prisoners in Paths of Glory, but he's one of the criminals in Kubrick's earlier film, The Killing, and he appeared in multiple John Cassavetes films. Timothy Carey is always sort of another one of these fringe, out-there actors who really just surfaced in strange, independent films and kind of made a bit of a brand out of himself that was this fringe character, this kind of weird-talking, weird guy, but I kind of liked his style. Another side actor in Paths of Glory was Joe Turkel, and he, of course, appeared again for Kubrick in The Shining as the bartender, and that might be his most famous appearance, but science fiction fans will also remember Joe Turkel as playing Dr. Eldon Tyrell in Ridley Scott's Blade Runner. Like Timothy Carey, Turkel also had a brief appearance in Kubrick's The Killing, although I can't recall honestly whether he had any dialogue. I think he might have had one or two lines. But that makes him one of the few actors who appeared in more than 2 Stanley Kubrick films. I shouldn't spend too much time on Stanley Kubrick, since we are talking about the Douglases. Of the 2, of course, Michael Douglas is the one I grew up with. Some of the films that we listed earlier were part of my growing up, in particular Romancing the Stone. I remember watching that many times as a kid. We had that movie on video disc, which was the precursor to Laserdisc and also the precursor to VHS. Not many people know about video discs, but they were basically like vinyl movies. If you know about cassette tapes for music, cassette tapes are roughly analogous to VHS tapes. And if you know about compact discs, then you know that compact discs are roughly analogous to laser discs. So video discs, which were before VHS or concurrent with VHS, are similar to vinyl records. Although, unlike vinyl records, they are no longer popular today, and definitely did not have the superior picture quality to our modern exhibition mediums, the way that vinyl is still considered one of the best ways to listen to music. In any case, we had a video disc of Romancing the Stone, and I remember watching that many times. Something in particular I remember about that time was that I was also a fan of the TV show Taxi. Now, that was a situation comedy starring an ensemble cast of actors who worked at a taxi company. And the boss in the show was played by Danny DeVito. Now, Danny DeVito, because of Romancing the Stone, would turn out to be the first actor as a kid that I recognized as being an actor, and not just the characters in the stories. I was young enough when these things were on that I sort of engaged with the stories but didn't make the connection of different actors playing different roles in different movies and TV shows. So I remember watching Romancing the Stone, and I believe it was the part where they've just found the emerald, and they were trying to, where they've just found the emerald, and Danny DeVito appears with the gun, and tries to steal the emerald from them and succeeds, if I remember correctly. And there's a very funny part where he's like rolling down a hill shortly after that, and I remember thinking it was so funny. But one time when he, I think, got to the end of his fall, I realized, hey, wait a minute, that's the guy from Taxi. And I think I said something about it out loud to my parents. I don't know what they must have thought about the revelation at the time, but for me it was a big deal to realize, hey, an actor is somebody who appears in all these different things. And in a way, I guess you could say that kind of meant that Danny DeVito was my first favorite actor, only by default. Similar to a few of the other people we've talked about so far in this segment of the Scroll, he's had his own sort of resurgence and explosion in recent times. Of course, he became hugely popular again in pop culture for his many-year run on It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. I think it's interesting because the show is more or less known for his performances as Frank that almost overshadow the popularity of the rest of the performances, except possibly for Charlie Day. But it's interesting that he came back, and I like that he came back. It's fun to see actors resurface, and it seems like today more than ever there's a bit of a environment that allows for nostalgia and resurgence, and shows that bring back popular people. As a long ongoing example of that, I think Curb Your Enthusiasm is a good example. But more recently, and I think somewhat delightful, is the show Only Murders in the Building, which stars big names of yesteryear, Steve Martin and Martin Short, both of whom are absolutely priceless in the show. And if you haven't had the chance to watch it yet, you should check it out. They both play a couple of more or less lonely old dudes in the same apartment building, fancy apartment building in New York City, who decide to try to solve what may have been a murder that took place, like the title suggests, in their building. I definitely can't recommend it enough. And it has some other good appearances from some other excellent actors, including a surprise multi-episode appearance of Nathan Lane, who I don't think I had seen in a very long time. And he really throws his back into the role that he plays. I don't want to give too much away because it's a mystery, and you should not know very much going in. Goodness, though, we got all the way out here from Michael Douglas. Michael Douglas still, through all of I think my entire life, has been somebody who shows up and appears in many things and is always him. Like, he's got a sound that I find comforting because I've grown up with him, and so I always find him pleasant to see or hear in a show, although I can't say that I necessarily like everything that he's done. I can still say that his presence I find comforting. And now with the technology we have, it's pretty crazy what you can do. Like in the Marvel movies where he appeared as a young version of himself and an old version of himself. And it's almost creepy how believable the young version is. But I don't want to talk too much about computerized young and old versions because, number one, I didn't really watch the big Martin Scorsese movie from a couple years ago. And number two, because it's creepy, and you probably don't want to be creeped out while you're trying to rest. And in that regard, we should probably not dwell. Since there are so many Douglas performances by both, I would be interested to know if I left out something important to you. Were you a fan of Wall Street? Or maybe I should have mentioned The Game. Let me know. Since the list here at yardbaker.com comes to an end on the D families here with the Douglases, I think this might be a good place to pause. There certainly are a number of famous acting families. I would imagine that for folks in these families, it's a bit easier to get into the business than for most, and likely a bit more difficult to get out. From A to D, have I mentioned your favorite acting family? If not, perhaps we can return to a scroll of famous acting families in the future. Are you still there? I would like to offer my sincerest apologies if the previous segment did not lull you to the state of unconsciousness or rest that was your goal for listening to this podcast. However, if you are hearing my voice now, then you are surely in for an even more mind-numbingly dull experience as I embark on one of my personal hobbies. In this edition of The Scroll, I return to describing for your benefit photographs of benches on my Instagram feed. See if you can keep track of how many benches we see. Our first image comes from achsas.bench. The bench is from Witten, Germany, according to the location information. Now, this photograph is of the images we've gone through on this scroll before, the most clearly and highly affected by Instagram filters that I've personally encountered. Perhaps even the most affected I've encountered on any bench photograph, inside or outside of our segments. It's extremely monochromatic. It's pretty much black and white. However, wherever there's color, there is only one color, and that one color is a bright cotton candy pink. And it's throughout almost the entire image. And the image is in a park. There is a gravel path in the background that has a bit of a T shape. And it terminates for us towards the center of the photograph and towards the right of the photograph into some woods. And on the left side of the photograph, where the path disappears up the middle, there appears to be some kind of a structure, like a wall of some kind, like a brick wall that might be separating this part of the park from a parking lot. However, it's difficult to say. And on closer zooming, there's also a little bit of broken concrete in the path. In the foreground is a bench, fairly basic park bench, a 3-slat back and a 3-slat seat. No other remarkable features, really, and it is surrounded by weeds and grass, and the grass is pink. In fact, if I were a betting person, I would say that what the artist has done here is replaced everything green in the photo with this cotton candy pink, because the grass is bright pink. Around the bench, the weeds are bright pink. The tree branches and bushes around the trees are bright pink. There's some leaves peeking into frame on the right side. They are pink. The wall actually looks like it could be brick, but it's taken on this pinkish hue. And directly behind the bench itself is a park-style garbage can, the kind that is on like a pole, like a basket garbage can. And I guess that's all there is to it. But again, everything is cotton candy pink except the gravel and the path behind the bench. There's gravel in the foreground as well, I should have mentioned. And the path behind the bench. And then the bench itself is a grayish white. And I suppose I should add that the bolts that seem to connect to the bench's supports, and it's really hard to tell what those styles are, and then also some of the labeling on the trash can, and a signpost near what we think might be a parking lot. Each of those things has a greenish hue, or almost a turquoise. So perhaps there was a color trade type of thing that happened here. Now, I'm not that familiar with extreme filtering on Instagram, and I don't know how sophisticated the color replacements are. So it's not clear to me necessarily what color those things are supposed to be, if they are not their actual color. But if they were this green, it would seem that they would have been replaced with cotton candy color. Very interesting. And now I'm also noticing that as I zoom in to see this, what I think is a sign by the parking lot, I can also see just where shade begins to accumulate around the edge of the woods, that there is yet another bench in the background with perhaps another trash can next to it. It's hard to tell. It's very small in the distance, and one thing that I can tell is that its construction is not the same as our hero bench in the foreground. So it's hard to say, whether it would have been the same builder or artist that made the bench. The one in the distance has only a 2-slat back, and I can see that the legs, or at least the supports for the seat of the bench, are larger wooden, like 2x4s, whereas our hero bench in the foreground has definitely got metal legs, I think. Still, it's a very striking photo at first, because you can just be hit with the extreme cotton candy pink. Yeah, I'm not normally a big fan of that kind of filtering. And like I said, it seems almost more sophisticated than an Instagram filter would allow. Like perhaps it was done in Lightroom, where very subtle color placements are a lot easier. The top hashtag in the description above all of the smaller hashtags is hashtag bench art. And I can see it. Oh, but this is interesting. Another hashtag is wooden bench, summer vibes, pastel, which it certainly is. But the interesting one here is hashtag computer art. So that would lead me to think that the artist chose to do this color replacement in a more sophisticated space than on Instagram. Very interesting. Well, definitely a more intriguing to think about bench than I thought we were going to get as our premier bench in this segment. Let's see what comes next. Our next bench is from a user who I don't know, Atelier Skokvis. Not an account I follow, but on a hashtag that I follow. I very recently decided to up my game a little bit and follow a few additional hashtags in addition to popular bench creators on Instagram to expand that to include hashtags so that we might find some new creators along the way and be able to see photos by non-bench enthusiasts who still had the wherewithal to include the hashtag in their post. And so this hashtag is, I'm going to mangle the pronunciation. The hashtag here would be, I want to say Bankje, Bankje. And this photo is of a pair of benches that are in a space that's difficult to describe, but I will try. The photo is at a low angle, and it's even looking down a little bit on the benches, so getting even the sense of the entire room is hard. It's a space that's indoors. As I've said, it's a room. And it looks like it could be perhaps a workout space, maybe. I don't see any distinct athletic equipment, but the photo is taken from a space on a riser, and the riser looks like it might be carpeted or cushioned, and the two benches that we can see are both on a polished concrete floor, so that doesn't seem like it would necessarily be an athletic space. But I do see a pillar, and the pillar has what might be padding on it. And that would lead me to think that perhaps I am looking at a performance space that might be partially soundproofed, but the wall in the background is a bright yellow and doesn't have any kind of sound dampening foam on it. So I'll describe the bench. It is a solid form that has no back. It's a no back bench. And the image is looking at it from the side. So you can see that the edge, or the end of the bench is a smooth polished wood, and then the sitting area of the bench is a wraparound slat that wraps from the floor on one side and goes all the way around to the floor on the other side in very small slats, maybe tops 2 inches wide. And the bench, I presume, is somewhat long, like maybe enough for 4 people. I can't tell for certain if both benches are the same length, but they are the same style of bench. And in that regard, they're somewhat unremarkable. If they are indeed both the same length, I think you could probably seat 4. Now, what's interesting about these benches is that if you're looking at them from the side, in the top left corner of the side of the bench, which is, again, just a flat surface, there is a hole, and out of the hole is sticking something round with a bright red stopper on the end of it. It appears to be some kind of functional protrusion, but I can't tell what it's for. Now, I can see that the other bench in the background has a similar protrusion, but the one in the background looks like it has a handle on the protrusion of the same color. So, I don't know. Like, my imagination wants to tell me that it's something that winds up like a music box. But why would that be the case here? Now, unfortunately, I don't speak whatever language this is in. However, Instagram is offering me the opportunity to use the translation, and I shall use that in a moment, but I should probably finish the description, because I haven't talked about the light. The light is definitely this kind of multi-source overhead light. In this case, the closest source to the bench is a relatively powerful downward spot on the bench, and it has a couple of other lighter shadows cast on it, and you can see a similar effect in the background on the bench in the background, and also the pole, which again is padded somehow. So I also get the impression that this room is not a regular square shape. It looks like, just in general, angles are strange in this room. Like, even the termination of the wall in the background, because there's 2 walls coming together, even their termination looks like it's slanted somehow. Like, even if we could pan this photo up, the room we would be looking at would not be a perfect box shape. Well, that definitely has piqued my interest, so to speak. So let's see if this translation sheds any further light on what we're looking at. Okay. Well, this might give us some insight. I'll read it as printed, but I suspect there are problems with the translation. Lazy lats and even more lats for the benches of stirk rail. 468 to be exact. The best of the world is the best. It's almost cryptic, but perhaps the main takeaway here is that these benches perhaps belong to a rail station. Maybe I can find out for our updates in the future whether Stirk Rail is a rail company. And our lats slats? Definitely something to look into. And that this person has counted them to find 468. And I do kind of like this final line. The best of the world is the best. I suppose there's an indisputable truth to that. Very fascinating. And I should add, if I haven't already, very modern looking. Not a throwback bench at all. Something that you would find perhaps even in a science fiction film. But maybe a science fiction film that was made in the 80s or 90s. I'm definitely a fan of science fiction, and I don't mind this bench. We find ourselves now on Summit Drive in Bendigo. I'm not sure where Bendigo is, but I might be able to figure it out later. This post comes from park_benches. This is a fairly straightforward, looking straight at the bench photo, taken from the sidewalk, likely in the park, a paved trail that goes through what is probably a neighborhood park, or perhaps just along the side of Summit Drive, as indicated by the location. The photo is taken from the sidewalk, and then about maybe 4 feet off of the sidewalk is a square cement slab or concrete slab with a bench on it. And it's interesting because it was chosen to put a bench in a lightly wooded space. Behind the bench is a small field, I want to say, with maybe a handful of trees, let's say not more than 10 total. And in the background you can see some fences and a couple of houses, so it's definitely a neighborhood park that might just be along the side of the road down a certain cul-de-sac. And the bench, strangely enough, was placed on a very out-of-place looking square cement slab, as though they didn't want it to be in the dirt. And I suppose that decision makes sense because it could get muddy. The ground around that slab is all dirt and it's not very grassy, so if it was storming, you would probably get muddy shoes. Although, why would you be sitting on a park bench in the middle of a storm? The particular bench is also not especially inviting. It's made of just industrial materials. The legs appear to be just some form of maybe aluminum, and then the seat of the bench is very shiny, and I would honestly be surprised if it's wood, although it is wood colored, but there are no slats. It's just a flat surface, and the flat surface is very reflective. In fact, you can see the reflection of the house and some trees in the background, which makes me think it's wood-colored, but probably also some kind of polished metal or plastic. And there is no back on the bench. It is just a flat surface. However, from this angle, it does look as though the bench itself is wide enough in the z-axis, moving away from the camera, that it could be accommodating to 2 separate groups of sitters, like one on one side of the bench away from camera and one on our side of the bench. It's hard to say for certain because although the photo is taken at about the, average height, we don't get a good sense of the exact dimension of the bench. And that's okay. As I said, it looks to be a suburban setting with a handful of trees of what type, I'm not positive. I'm not great with trees. And in the background, there does appear to be perhaps a neighborhood or some other facility. Maybe there's a school back there. It's difficult to say for certain. Let's have a look at the description. Found a new park that has an oversized park bench which takes into account the impact of the modern Western diet. That's very funny. I hope it hasn't caused you to wake up laughing, or wake up a loved one with your laughter. Takes into account the impact of the modern Western diet. So this does confirm my suspicion that the width of the bench is actually substantial, and furthermore that its construction of metal and perhaps a sturdy plastic is meant to be load-bearing of the probably distinctly American diet, but it does say Western. Very interesting. Well, perhaps we can find out where Bendigo is. And in any case, if you find yourself in Bendigo, and you need a bench that is considerably load-bearing, you know that you can find one on Summit Drive. Next we have a photo that I won't spend too much time on, but I want to mention it because I find it interesting. It is, in fact, the same as the first bench that we encountered on this scroll. It is from Achsas.bench from Witten, Germany, and it is in fact the same photo, except this one has not been affected by computerized graphics work, and it is only black and white. However, I wanted to just mention that what's interesting about it being only in black and white is that it is easier now to see the actual contours of the landscape. So as I said before, there was grass, and the bench was on the grass, and there was a path behind the bench, and that there was a structure on the left side that might be a parking lot. What we can see now without the cotton candy color is that the bench itself is actually on a bit of a decline in the landscape, and the ground behind it curves upward to the path, so the bench is in a little bit of a depression in the ground, and that the path actually slopes upward in the background, and the grass to the left of the path leading up to the parking area is also sloped, so we can actually see better the topography of this park area that was actually very well hidden when it was so bright with the pink cotton candy color. I find that fascinating, that you can take the same image and with just a different change to the color, change actually even the sense of perspective that the photograph gives you. Very interesting. Our journey next takes us to Dealerwood with a photo by Vondelbankjes. This one is actually quite striking. It's very monochromatic, but it has color. It looks like perhaps an autumn day, or it most definitely is an autumn day because there's quite a lot of dried leaves on the ground. And here we get another backless bench. It seems to be our thing right now. So the bench is a simple construction, just two posts made of probably wood, but it could be cement. And then the seat is just two planks. And it looks to be even perhaps unfinished wood. And there are tree branches poking down in the frame from the top. And you can see that some of the leaves have fallen on the bench and have been left there undisturbed. Now the bench is surrounded by leaves and some drying grass. Then just beyond the bench, maybe another 4 feet, is a fence. But the fence is of that kind of industrial quality where there's a metal pole, and then the fence is just some more or less wire. with rectangular holes in it that are just spread out, like the kind you would find that separates two properties in the woods, where there's nothing there for aesthetics, just to mark the edge of a property. And marking the edge of a property it does indeed. Just on the other side of the fence is a green bush. In fact, the most colorful element in the photo is this green bush. And then coming from the bush, or perhaps next to the bush, is a partner bush with some red autumn color leaves. And there is grass, short grass, around the bush and its companion bush. And then in the distance you can see tracts of brown farmland going deep, deep into the distance, almost as far as the eye can see. An empty and unused or currently unused farmland. There aren't any visible crops. There isn't any visible farm equipment. It just looks like barren dirt. And then way, way, way off in the distance is a thin line of trees that goes from one edge of the frame to the other, just below the line of the fence. And then above the line of the fence, before you get to the near branches of the tree that has dropped its leaves on the bench, is a fairly well striated gray autumn sky with layers of clouds that look very gloomy. It's actually a very nice autumn photo. Let's have a look at the description, which is brief, and see if the translation can help us. It just says, bench with a view in the Dealerwood. Well, there you go. Bench with a view in Dealerwood. If you happen to find yourself there, we now know of a bench that you can appreciate the barren farming landscape on. Here we are now in Peine, Germany. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. I probably did not, but I'm sure many of you who speak German would know how to fix that. This photo comes from Beautiful World of Benches, and it is definitely the most busy and intricate photo for us to talk about. There's a lot to look at here, a lot to unpack, if you will. So I'm just going to say right off the bat that my impression of this environment is a perhaps library in an urban setting, because the landscaping around this bench is very intentional, the placement of the bench is very intentional, and there's also basically no greenery. It's all cement and sculpture. There's actually perhaps 2 sculptures, if not one, that works together. So in the foreground, we are looking side on at a crescent-shaped bench, another without a back. It's got perhaps 4 or 5 speckled concrete legs that travel the width of the bench, and then the bench itself is an accordion-looking series of wooden slats that are relatively thick. It almost looks like a piano, and it's backed up right against a planter, and the planter sadly doesn't have very much going on in it except weeds. Some of the weeds are dead, and a few of the weeds are alive. We are, of course, in autumn, and that is evidenced not only by the mostly dead planter, but there is a single yellow leaf on the ground next to the bench. The ground is a grid of stone tiles or cement tiles that lead away from the bench and towards the building in the background. But before we can get to the building, directly next to the bench, for us behind the bench, because we're looking sideways at the bench, is I have to say, a sculpture. I can't tell if everything going on here is part of the sculpture, but the ground that the sculpture is on is different from the tiled walkway that stretches away from the bench in this sort of terrace area. It is more square stone tiles, but they're a different kind of stone, and they're a different color. And they are surrounded by a border of perhaps rectangular tiles that are in a different grid. They're not in a grid, they're just surrounding the outside of this space. And then inside the space is a grid of stone tiles, but they're at a completely different angle from the ones that the bench is sitting on. And they slope downward or inward. And in the center is maybe a quartz or some kind of stone formation that is very weather-worn, and it looks like it was just cut out of the side of a cliff and placed there. It looks very rough, very jagged and hard and ancient. And then sitting on top of this rock, which seems to have a little bit of a pedestal underneath. In fact, with the sloping, I'm beginning to think that this could even be a fountain. Now, on top of this jagged, rough-looking rock is a relatively large, extremely shiny, black sphere. It almost looks like an oversized bowling ball. And indeed, it would be a very oversized bowling ball, because we have a little bit of a sense of perspective looking at this photo, and a sense of size, because another element to this sculpture, behind the sphere, behind the stone, and a little on the upward slope of the edge of this sculpture area, are two statues, and they are of almost cartoonishly thin and long-necked people, but it is a couple, a gentleman in perhaps a poncho or a long sweater, and a lady in a dress. I can't see his feet, but she might be barefoot. They're almost alien-looking. They remind me of what I might think the Belters look like in The Expanse, a book that I've been reading on the Kobo Clara HD e-reader from Rakuten. And incidentally, if you are not familiar with the Kobo Clara HD e-reader from Rakuten, you can go back a couple of episodes where we begin the journey of learning more about that device by reading its operating manual. But let's not go too far afield. So that's the entirety of the statue, and it's a very small space, it seems. It doesn't seem like much, and it almost seems like it's been placed inconveniently on the edge of this courtyard, because there are bollards, stone bollards that kind of match some of the other architecture here, separating the statue from what looks like the background parking lot. Now, the background parking lot has the same stone grid that is around the bench, and there is a parking sign that might be a handicap parking sign that has the same kind of round, almost pond-like grid that the statue has, as though the parking sign is another statue. Now, behind the couple, there is what looks to be accessible ramp going up to the building, and then we can just see on the left edge of frame the stairs and the handrail that go up as well. Now, I can tell that there is a parking lot back there because there are, in fact, parked vehicles, and there are more parking signs. And I can see the most distant parking sign has a handicap symbol on it. And it's near a trash can, a green industrial trash can, and near a garage. The garage, it appears, might actually belong to the building on the termination of the property, which appears like it might be an apartment building. And then, we can see the edge of this, what I'm going to say is a library. And it has bright red windows, or window frames, and very reflective glass. And it's very modern. The whole feel here is very modern. Although the apartment building has some geometric designs on the side that feel older. But the garage next to the industrial trash can looks extremely, extremely modern. It doesn't have a hint, even a style of something that's old. And then coming just off of the apartment building is a offshoot. It's on the other side of the building, so we're just getting the hint of it. There is a sloped roof, and it may be connecting to the next building over, but I don't think it is. But it is tiled. It looks like a red tiled roof, or like a beigeish red, like a mission-style tile. And then further beyond that, there is a beige building with the same sort of mission tile roofing. And I can see on its roof what might be like a little, maybe satellite dish, but it's not pointing upward. And what's also interesting, if you look closely, you can see that in the mission tiling, all of the red tiles, there are a series of painted tiles that spell out initials. And the initials are BJC. Not sure what that is. But there's so much to look at here. I think I forgot to mention that there were those stone bollards, but what's funny is that they're maybe at best knee-high, and I feel like probably somebody stumbled over them at some point, because there is, just on the underside of that, a probably more recent aluminum post that has been put up that's about 2 or 3 feet taller, as if to say, hey, don't trip over this stone thing. Yeah, this is a very, very busy photo. I like it. Why don't we have a look at the description? Here we go. Curved wooden bench in Pina with happy metal couple in the background. Heart emoji. Well, that's all we get. I feel like I described that already. Although maybe I didn't describe the couple as happy. In fact, I didn't do a very good job of describing the couple. They're holding hands and looking longingly into each other's eyes. I suppose I was just more distracted by the somewhat frightening nature of their builds. In any case, you can find a place in Germany that may or may not be a library, with a stone-loving couple by what might be a bowling ball fountain in front of what might be a library. I find myself once again feeling obligated to stop and describe a photo, because we have come back to Ochsas Bench in Witten, Germany, for what I presume to be the closest to the original photo that we have seen. This one is full color, not black and white or monochromatic, and no cotton candy. This time there is very little new revelation to take away from the photo compared with the black and white version that we saw before. But I will confirm one or two things about the original photo. For starters, the trash can that is on a post behind our main bench is in fact bright yellow. If there's any indication that the saturation has been turned up on this photo, it's the yellow trash can on the yellow metal pole. The greenery around the bench is also very vibrant, and I think there was some tweaks to the saturation here. But the bench is just as monochromatic as ever. It looks basically identical in every single photo. And now I can confirm that the sign in the background and the bolts on the bench are a bit of a blue color, and that would be why they maintained some of that blue color even through the process of the cotton candying of the other photo. And there is indeed enough saturation that we can now see just a little bit, perhaps, of blue sky in the thick woods behind. Well, this is interesting. Although there's not much more to add at this point, it has been kind of fun to encounter the same bench over and over with a few breaks in between as we looked at other benches. I hope that hasn't been too interesting for you, but maybe just intriguing enough to entertain your subconscious mind. Let's see if we can get one more in here before it's time to stop. Our final photo is appropriately surreal and dreamlike. It comes to us via the hashtag bench photography. And the photographer indeed is very, very serious. It looks like an image out of the Seventh Seal. This by Alexandri Seleftherios. I apologize, Alexandri, if I didn't get your name right. This is a striking photo taken from the ground. And in our foreground, there is a flat, chessboard-like surface. And we, the photographer or the viewer, are underneath a very clear line of shade, perhaps by a rooftop, an overhang of some kind, not natural. And there's very little natural in the foreground of this photo. It is certainly a clashing of nature and construction. So there is this chessboard before us. And by the way, this photo is a very high contrast, black and white, very serious looking. Now, beyond the edge of the chessboard are two benches sitting next to each other. And the photo is so high contrast that we really can't tell the color of the benches or what they're made out of. But what's interesting is that they both look to be in extreme disrepair, or else they were both made very haphazardly with found driftwood or something. Perhaps they are meant to have a maritime theme, because we are surely near the water, as I will describe shortly. But yes, this is a view of these benches from behind. And they have a seat and they have a back, but they're there's no even clear sense of form to them beyond that. Like, they are obviously benches, but the wood is splintering in some places, and there's an uneven number of planks, and the planks stick out farther than others. And it really emotionally goes against the very measured and very specific nature of the chessboard that leads up to it. The chessboard is perfect squares leading up to this just absolutely chaotic design. Now, also, there are two people sitting on these benches. Two men, it would appear, and they are on opposite ends of the benches from each other, so they are at the farthest side of the frame that they can get from one another. One of them has his legs crossed and appears as though he may be reading a book, and the other has his arms perhaps in his lap, his legs open, as though he's just gazing out to sea. And indeed beyond them both is the sea, which breaks the sky about halfway up the frame. And there's sun shining down from the left side of frame onto the water, so the terminating side of the right frame has dark water, and the left side of the frame has bright shining water. And then indeed the top half of the frame is an expression of beautiful clouds that are just lit up. They're stretching in all directions. They're not the puffy variety. They're the streaky kind of almost like exploding clouds. There's some puffy ones in the distance, farther off, near the horizon. But you can tell that if this was sunset, it would just be glowing with purple and yellow and blue and red, and it would just be awe-inspiring. And above the head of the man on the left side of frame is a small group of 3 birds flying over the water. It's very striking, and the contemplative look of the 2 men really give it that Bergman-esque feel I was just talking about at the beginning. It's very interesting. I wonder if we can learn more from the description. No. Description is a series of hashtags explaining that this is black and white, meant to signify loneliness, and I can say that it definitely has some loneliness to it, but it seems more contemplative than lonely. But there is hashtag lonely, hashtag loneliness, hashtag lonely photography. And there are some hashtags that tell us about the camera. It is a Nikon D3500, and it looks as though he was shooting with a Sigma 1750 f/28. 1750. I assume perhaps that it was a 50 millimeter and an f/2.8. I don't know what this. Maybe it's a 17 to 50 zoom. It seems like a narrow zoom, and it doesn't look like it's distorted. I may have to get back to you on what that is exactly. Personally, never a big fan of the Sigma lenses. I've done a good amount of photography and never very much cared for the quality of glass that came with the Sigma, but in this case the photograph is quite beautiful and it looks very sharp on my phone. But for me, the only Sigma I ever had did not return the most beautiful of photos. I'm not sure if I even still have the lens. I think it might have been the wide lens I had until I finally got a good Nikon wide angle. But perhaps I can look into that. More hashtags: street photography, street photographer, street photographers, Polio-Faliro. Perhaps this is the location. Faliro. Well, I can look into this and certainly get back to you in our next episode. And I hope you've enjoyed this scroll. Okay, well, that was a very good number of benches for one sitting. Do you know how many benches we encountered? We looked at 8 photographs, but since 3 photographs were of the same bench, in fact were the same photograph, we really only looked at 6 benches. I think we can say that 8 or 6 is a fairly accurate count of the benches we saw on Instagram for the scroll. And thank you for joining me for the scroll. Did you like hearing about benches? What do you like to scroll before going to bed at night? I think we'll leave it here for this episode. I hope you have been adequately rambled to rest and are not hearing what I am saying right now. However, if for some reason you are conscious at this time, I will leave you with these parting words. Robust, glib, poke, bike, sedate, advertisement, repeat, cloth, carpenter, behave, paddle, and cows. Thank you again. I am your host, Ryan. Music has been by Disparition, and I will see you in the next episode.